Do you find these Zone 6 Studios large format cameras attractive, gaudy, or just indifferent to their look? Aesthetics aside, these 20th century cameras pack a ridiculous amount of functionality that make them contenders even amongst all the modern day technically advanced cameras. Let's take a closer look. In front of me, I have two wooden field cameras manufactured by Zone 6 Studios. This is the 4x5 version, and this is the 8x10 edition. Other than the obvious size difference and form factor, at first glance you might think that these cameras are identical. But a closer inspection reveals some subtle clues alluding to the storied past of this camera manufacturer. Thankfully, you don't have to be the Sherlock Holmes of large format camera manufacturers to figure out the mystery of when your camera was produced. You just need an article titled The Zone 6 Camera, the Fred Picker Era, authored by Richard T. Ritter in the January-February 2003 issue of the View Camera Journal. According to Ritter, the only authentic versions of these cameras, and by that he means not manufactured by a third party, can be identified by the front plate badging that says, "Made by Zone 6 Studios, Newfane, Vermont, USA." Both of my cameras have this identifying badging, so it should follow that my commentary is aptly applicable to the era in which they were manufactured. More precisely, between mid to late 1988 and 1991, with serial numbers in the 1000 to about 4500 range for the 4x5 versions and 1 to about 350 for the 8x10 editions. You should be aware that there are some versions of these authentic cameras in the 9000 serial number range that were special edition models made of black walnut and cherry, which is in contrast to the standard Honduran mahogany. If you own any of these versions of the Zone 6 Studios cameras, please share with all of us in the comments. Based on the information in Ritter's article, I believe that my 8x10 version was manufactured in 1989 because bigger knobs and these sliding latches were introduced and the camera still had no bail lever, which wasn't introduced until 1990. The serial number of 117 also suggests that it was an earlier model. I believe that my 4x5 edition was manufactured in 1991 because that was the year that all of the metalwork was gold-plated to commemorate the 20th anniversary of Zone 6 Studios, as opposed to the standard brass. Ritter adds that these editions are identifiable by their serial numbers, which fall within the range of 3000 to 4000. My 4x5 serial number is 3914, so it fits within this narrative. Interestingly, this is also the same year that Zone 6 Studios was purchased by Calumet Photographic. Let's move on to the features of these cameras. Since these cameras were produced 2 years apart, there are some functional differences that I'll point out as we tour the cameras. The first item to note is that these are traditionally designed cameras where the bellows and front standard are completely contained within a wooden frame box and therefore protected from inadvertently being damaged during transport. They kind of look like lunchboxes, right? The bottom of both cameras includes a strong 3/8 inch thread for attaching a base plate to. I've never had any issues with these despite the same anchor point being used on both format sizes. For what it's worth, I use a 3/8 to 1/4 inch adapter to accommodate my Arca Swiss style base plate. To unfold the camera from its lunchbox position, begin by loosening the two rear standard knobs. On the 4x5 model, release the locking latch at the front of the camera. The 8x10 version has two of these. Once the latches are out of the way, raise the standard to its upright position. The rear standard has detents that allow the photographer to find the 90-degree upright position, also referred to as the zero or normal position. This position is where the standards are parallel to one another and at 90 degrees to the base of the camera, just like a rigid body camera. I have found that the fastest way to engage these detents is to apply opposing pressure as you open the camera. Once the rear standard is in the zero position, lock the rear standard knobs down. If you are interested in rear tilt, these cameras will go beyond the zero position by about 30 degrees for the 4x5 version and about 43 degrees for the 8x10 edition. To set up the front standard, you loosen 4 of the front standard knobs, which include the lens tilt and base tilt knobs. Begin raising the front standard by pulling up on the metal guides while simultaneously pushing the bellows towards the rear of the camera. The reason for this is to avoid friction wear between the metalwork and the bellows. Over time, that could potentially cause enough wear to result in light leaks. I don't know about you, but I really don't like unexpected anomalies showing up on my developed film. Bring the front standard to its upright position by raising it towards the front of the camera. The base tilt knobs have detents to quickly put the camera into its zero position. I do this by applying opposing pressure to the two metal supports at the base of the front standard, followed by tightening the knobs. Next, raise the lens mounting frame so that the detent indicators are aligned. Both the base tilt and lens tilt can be extended far beyond the image circle, as is the case with most view cameras, so I'd be surprised if anyone ever complained of running out of movement flexibility with these cameras. The bellows is almost certainly the limiting factor for movement flexibility among most large format cameras. As far as front swing is concerned, the 4x5 version has about 10 degrees of flexibility in either direction, while the 8x10 has about 14 degrees. Front shift for the 4x5 is about 14 millimeters to the right or the left of the center position, while the 8x10 version has about 35 millimeters. As you may have gathered, these two knobs are used to tighten and loosen the mechanism for both swing and shift. Interestingly, the 4x5 camera has a pin nail to indicate and align the front standard to the center position, while the 8x10 version does not. To help find the center position on the 8x10, I used a sharp point to make a barely visible reference dot. As an alternative, the entry stroke swash of the letter N in Newfane could also be used as a pretty close reference point to indicate the center position on both of these cameras. Front rise is about 40 millimeters of travel with about 32 millimeters of fall for the 4x5 edition, while the 8x10 has about 67 millimeters of rise and about 80 millimeters of fall. Again, more than plenty movement flexibility. I think it goes without saying that the front standards are unique in that they employ both base and axial tilt mechanisms. While having a dual tilt mechanism may not seem all that significant, especially when compared with modern cameras that are designed to collapse the bellows until they are just about as flat as a pancake, I have found that with wide-angle photography, I sometimes have to simultaneously manipulate the axial and base tilt in order to achieve proper focus of these cameras. This is due to the focusing bed design of these cameras. Bringing the standards to their closest positions results in the independent focusing beds hitting one another, causing an obstruction and limiting the ability to focus at infinity on wide-angle lenses. This has been especially frustrating when using my 6x17 panel back on my modified 4x5 edition of these cameras. You absolutely have to have a recessed lens board with a 90mm or wider lens with the 4x5 version, which subsequently brings a whole set of other problems beyond our discussion of these cameras. Since I'm on a complaint rant, the other point that I do get frustrated with is that the front standard on both of these cameras lacks the ability to use two knobs to independently lock the lens mounting frame from the lens tilt mechanism. This is such a great feature that my Chamonix 8x10 Alpinist X convertible camera has that enables me to use lens tilt without having the lens come crashing down to the base of the camera. If you're interested in learning more about that camera, I'll put a link to my video in the description. In my experience using these Zone 6 Studios cameras, the right knob can be used to lock the rise and fall of the front standard, while leaving the left knob loose so that you can apply lens tilt, followed by locking down that position. However, what tends to happen is that using the lens tilt loosens the rise and fall knob to the point that the lens falls from its intended position. In the camera's defense, page 3, step 4 of the instruction manual for the Zone 6 Classic camera describes using both left and right knobs to lock these movements down, and then utilizing base tilt to achieve the desired tilt. I think it goes without saying that lighter lenses will be less of an issue, but watch out for those ridiculously heavy lenses like the Nikon Nikkor 150mm SW lens, a beautiful lens that requires a sturdy front standard. Check out my review of that lens by clicking on the link to it in the description, after watching this video to the very end, of course. Speaking of lenses, the wooden frame accommodates 4x4-inch lens boards on the 4x5 edition, while the 8x10 version uses the Canon 6x6-inch lens board size. I prefer to keep all of my lenses on the smallest lens board possible so that they occupy less space in my bag. To accomplish this goal with my 8x10 camera, I have a Canon to Linhof style lens board adapter. Just remember that some lenses, like the ridiculously huge Nikon Nikkor 150mm SW lens, have such an enormous rear element that it's impossible for them to fit into the narrow opening of the lens board adapter. So lenses like these have to remain on a larger lens board. I think it's important to note that if you want to standardize your lens board size to the Linhof format with these Zone 6 Studios cameras, there is a 4x4 Linhof lens board adapter available on eBay that would allow you to seamlessly use your lenses across both formats or other cameras you own. So I could put most of my lenses on Linhof lens boards and use the camera-specific lens board adapters to enable me to use most of my lenses without having to go through the time-consuming process of swapping out my lens boards. I think it goes without saying that this enables us photographers to buy lenses that accommodate our largest film size format and use them on cameras designed for smaller size film stocks. Conversely, you could also use lenses designed for smaller formats on larger film to create interesting images with the entire image circle of the lens, or use them for macro photography on the larger formats without concern of running out of image circle. I haven't tried this yet, but it is a tempting proposition. It's just more money down the endless rabbit hole of gear acquisition. Mounting lenses to the camera is really easy and smooth on these Zone 6 Studios cameras. You simply insert the lens board into the light trap and slide these very smooth operating levers over the lens board to lock it in place. I think it's worth mentioning that this mechanism works so well because of the attention to detail. The sliding levers are sandwiched between two plastic wedges that have a chamfer to them, which allows the mechanism to progressively tighten down on the lens board. Simple, but brilliant. You gotta love that. Moving on to the rear standard. The 4x5 version has about 30 degrees of rear tilt, while the 8x10 edition is capable of about 43 degrees. As far as forward tilt is concerned, these cameras are only limited by the bellows. The 4x5 version is capable of about 10 degrees of rear swing, while the 8x10 edition has about 13 degrees. The mechanisms used to unlock and lock down rear swing are vastly different between these two formats. The 4x5 uses these two control knobs, while the 8x10 edition uses swing levers. Both mechanisms seem to work equally well, but I do find that my thick fingers are a bit cramped using the 8x10 edition's mechanism, which is located under the ground glass in a confined space. But then again, I'm rarely ever using rear swing for the type of photography I enjoy, so for me it's not that big of a deal. You might care more about this if you're an architectural photographer with pituitary gigantism. Since these cameras represent two separate generations of camera production, there are some notable differences in the ground glass back. The 1989 8x10 camera has no bail lever and uses a traditional piece of glass for the viewing screen. The 1991 4x5 edition has a much appreciated bail lever and uses a combined acrylic Fresnel viewing screen, which is protected with a plain piece of glass. I would speculate that the difference in brightness between these screens equates to about a stop difference. You might also note that these ground glasses have different grid spacings, but nothing that would make me favor one over the other. Both cameras can easily be switched from a horizontal to vertical position by using these sliding levers. The ground glass back also includes these two convenient bubble levels to get you in the ballpark of being parallel to the horizontal plane. There's an additional bubble level on the right side of the rear standard that is used to judge your alignment with the vertical plane. As a side note, Richard Ritter, who was responsible for the design and construction of many of the Zone 6 Studios products over the course of 15 years, currently services and builds custom cameras. He can even add a bail lever to your camera if it doesn't already have one. That's an option that I have considered for my 8x10 camera because it is such an important feature to me. It allows for easier insertion of the film holders while minimizing the risk of moving the camera out of its intended position. I don't know about you, but I'm not interested in surprise compositional changes. The bellows on both these cameras are made of multi-layered synthetic materials that still have an odor that reminds me of being in the darkroom. Does anybody else like that smell, or is it just me? That's where the similarities for these bellows on these cameras ends. The 4x5 edition is unique because it has a removable bellows that can be interchanged with a bag bellows. For viewers that are unaware, a bag bellows is used with wide-angle lenses to increase the flexibility with applying movements without running into problems with the bellows causing restrictions. To accomplish this exchange, you remove the ground glass back by sliding the levers away from the camera, slide the front standard levers to the unlock position, and remove the bellows through the rear standard. Then reverse the process for the bag bellows. For what it's worth, I've only used the bag bellows once since 2009, and that was for an assignment in my large format photography class at Appalachian State University with Professor John Scarlatta, whom sold me this 4x5 camera for $1,100 about a year before he passed away. I've never had any interference with movements from the standard accordion type bellows in my landscape or portrait photography. However, you'll definitely be limited by the standard bellows if you like to incorporate rise and fall in your wide-angle photographs. Compressing the bellows like a sandwich doesn't leave sufficient flexibility for lateral movements of the front standard and is likely a situation that can benefit from using the bag bellows. One last impressive feature specific to the 4x5 edition is that the bellows are capable of extending to about 20 inches. That was not a common feature for field cameras at the time that these Zone 6 Studios cameras were being manufactured. Arguably, you could make a case that it's still not that common, at least not without an accessory extension focusing bed. The 8x10 edition utilizes a fixed accordion style bellows that maximally extends to 30 inches and minimally draws to 6 inches using the focusing knobs. I think it's worth noting that you can extend the bellows a bit more to 35 inches by manually pulling the focusing beds beyond the gears and using clamps to lock down the focusing beds. Conversely, if you use the combined axial and base tilts I mentioned earlier, you can get the bellows to draw down to roughly 2 inches on the 4x5 version and about 2.5 inches on the 8x10 edition, but you won't have any flexibility to use movements. Additionally, the 8x10 cameras has this metal ring that enables you to support the bellows and minimize sagging to avoid mechanically producing vignette. One issue that I've had with the 4x5 version is that the bellows came partially unglued from the plastic mounting frame. But that was probably my fault because I really stretched the bellows far out for a macro shot, which in retrospect was not a great idea. I easily repaired this by using some contact cement and reinforcing it with gaffer's tape. These Zone 6 Studios cameras use a traditional approach to focusing. The two knobs on the left side of the camera, from the perspective of facing the ground glass, are used to unlock and lock the focusing bed, while the two knobs on the right side of the camera are used to focus. The front knobs correspond to the front standard, while the rear knobs correspond to the rear standard. Just remember, if you focus using the front standard, this will change the distance between the lens and the object you are photographing, which subsequently alters the magnification of the projected image on the ground glass. In contrast, using the rear standard to focus retains the object to lens distance relationship, but the perspective or relative size and shape of objects can potentially change if you use movements to focus. If you'd like to learn more about techniques used to focus your large format camera, I'll leave a link to my focusing video in the description. It'll give you all the clarity you need to achieve critical focus. But I digress. The focusing mechanism on both of these cameras is smooth and precise due to the geared operation of the focusing beds. You can also really crank down on the locking knobs to make sure that your focus doesn't inadvertently move, which I have had happen to me during my wave hike using a modern rear-focused 8x10 camera that didn't have a focus lock. A frustratingly hard lesson learned given the fact that winning the lottery to go on this hike is so difficult. So for me, having the ability to solidly lock down my focus is a ridiculously huge deal. I'm all about minimizing the mishaps. It's just like Forrest Gump said, "That's good. One last thing." Let's move on to closing these cameras back into their lunchbox position. This basically involves bringing your focusing beds and standards back to their zero positions. The one cautionary move that I do here with the front standard is to slide the wooden frame to the top of the guide rail prior to folding the front standard. This helps minimize chafing the bellows on the metalwork that occurs if you don't do this maneuver. This tip is provided in the Zone 6 Classic Camera Instruction Manual on page 3, step 4. The late Fred Picker discusses that this is not a design flaw, but a necessary constructive element to maintain a larger front rise and inclusion of a more aesthetically pleasing, continually tapered bellows. Once the front standard is folded down, the rear standard knobs can be loosened, the rear standard folded back down, the knobs tightened into the locked position, and secured with the latch. The last feature that might be worth mentioning is that both of these cameras have a leather handle strap for easier handling. Now that's handy, puns intended. Please note that there are some minor aesthetic differences in handles between the camera generations. Thus far, I've mentioned two downsides to these cameras. One being that the focusing beds collide at the minimum bellows draw, resulting in a limitation in focusing wide-angle lenses. This forces the photographer to simultaneously manipulate the axial and base tilts in order to focus properly, that subsequently limits camera movements. The other being that these cameras lack dedicated, independent controls of the axial tilt and rise and fall movements, so that heavier lenses don't come crashing down on the focusing bed. Those are really minor complaints that I have in comparison to the biggest and most flagrant obstacle that these cameras introduce into my personal workflow: the ridiculously heavy weight and size of these cameras. There's a hefty price to be paid for all of that solid metal and protective self-contained closed sandwich box position. They are beautifully crafted and traditionally designed cameras, but man, do they make hiking far distances less enjoyable, especially the 8x10 version, which weighs in at 14 pounds, while the 4x5 weighs 6.6 pounds. Before you start thinking that the 4x5 version is pretty light, consider this. My Chamonix Alpinus X convertible 8x10 camera only weighs 6.9 pounds. That's less than a half a pound difference for a camera that has 4 times the resolution of 4x5. Since my goal is to print a handful of ridiculously huge prints for my family's home, for me, there's no contest. Give me my 8x10 camera, but keep my pack as light as possible. That's a top priority for me, so that I can enjoy creating images in the amazing landscapes of the American Southwest without being overly physically fatigued. Speaking of physicality, check out my exercise for photographers video to see how I keep myself in top shape to handle these ridiculously heavy cameras. I'll leave a link to it in the description. To be fair to these cameras, if you are using them at close distances to your vehicle or in the studio, then the weight becomes much less of an issue. In fact, you may not even care about it. In the end, only you can decide if the weight of these cameras presents a hindrance to your workflow. What about durability? Will these cameras take a beating? Oh, yes they can. Both of my cameras have taken some serious tumble over the years, resulting in various parts of the wood fracturing. Thankfully, with the use of wood glue and clamps, I've been able to join the broken parts back together. Now, I'm not proud that I've damaged the aesthetics of my cameras, but it is reassuring to know that you can get them functional again with basic supplies. Here's a summary table comparing the specifications of both of these cameras. So, what are my concluding thoughts about these Zone 6 Studios View cameras? Would I still purchase these cameras in 2025? The short and honest answer is no. I think you may already know why, but please allow me to explain so no one feels that I am bashing these masterfully designed cameras. When I started my large format journey in 2009, the same year I purchased my 4x5 version of this camera, I wasn't familiar with many camera brands, nor did I have a sense of what types of subject matter I really enjoy shooting with these kinds of cameras. So it was, and still is, a great camera to learn large format. I got lots of practice making mistakes on 4x5 film at a fraction of the cost of bigger film. It was only in 2015 that I realized my passion for the ridiculously huge 8x10 format. So that's when I opted for the 8x10 version of the Zone 6 Studios View camera because I was already familiar with the camera's operation and brand quality. As a historical footnote, at the time the Chamonix Alpinus X convertible camera wasn't available. They were only making horizontal only or vertical only versions of these cameras, which was a firm no for me. I like having the ability to swap between horizontal and vertical compositions. Intrepid's Kickstarter campaign for their lightweight 8x10 version didn't begin until 2017. Those are important footnotes because the idea of owning a lightweight 8x10 camera with all of the functionality of my Zone 6 Studios 4x5 in 2015 was merely a fantasy. Today, it's an entirely different ballgame. There are a number of camera manufacturers that are producing highly capable, brand new units designed to accommodate the varying needs of photographers at different price points. So, if I was starting out today, I would shop for the most well-built, functional, and lightweight camera available because that fits my need to reduce my pack weight to make hiking more enjoyable while still giving me the option to shoot large format. I just want the camera to get out of my way of being creative. Getting my 8x10 large format gear under 30 pounds was a ridiculously huge challenge, but I've finally gotten to the point where I feel comfortably confident to take my 8x10 kit on hikes through the landscapes that I love. If you'd like to see how I accomplished this feat, be sure to check out my video on my 8x10 large format backpack kit. I'll leave a link to it in the description. With that said, if you are looking for a high quality, solidly built, exceptionally capable camera with generous movements that will serve you for years to come, and don't mind the weight of these cameras, you cannot go wrong with a Zone 6 Studios camera, as long as you find one that isn't too beat up, since they are no longer made. Do you have experience shooting with the Zone 6 Studios large format camera? Please share your thoughts with all of us in the comments. If you've enjoyed this content, I would greatly appreciate your show of support for my channel by giving this video a thumbs up, subscribing to my channel, and clicking on any of the Amazon links in the description to search for an item you're interested in. Any purchase, regardless of the item, contributes to a commission I receive from Amazon that costs you absolutely nothing. As always, thanks for watching.